Common percentages of increase and decrease. We're going to use 300. And again, let's look at this as money, $300. Okay, so first of all, 300 represents the original amount, so we'll call that 100%. Now, 10% of 300, we'll divide this by 10, or should I say, move the decimal back, it'll be 30. So 10% is 30. So to increase that by 30, this becomes 330 when you add them. 330 represents 110% of the original. Now, let's get 5% increase. Let's see, 300 represents 100% of the amount. Well, to find 5%, we look at the 10%. 10% is represented by 30. So 5% will be represented by half of 30, or half of the 10% amount. So half of 30 would be 15. So we're going to increase this by 15. This will give us 315, which represents 105%. That's your 5% increase. Okay, let's take a look at a 20% increase. 300 represents 100%. That's the original. So what would 20% represent? Well, if 10% represents 30, then 20% is going to represent twice 30, which is 60. So we'll increase it, and it goes up to 360. 360 represents 120%. Okay, let's look at 300 with a 25% increase. 300 represents 100% of the original. Now, 25%, we'll find that by looking at the 20% and the 5%. The 20% is 60. The 5% is 15. When you combine the 60 and the 15, you get 75. So 75 represents your 25%. So let's increase it by adding it. We get 375, which represents 125%. Okay, now let's look at decreases. We have $400. We want a 10% decrease. So first, 400 represents 100% of the amount. 10% will be represented by dividing this by 10, which makes it 40. So 40 is the 10%. Now to decrease it by 40, this becomes 360. Or should we say this is now 90%? It's the 10% decrease. Now we want to make a 5% decrease. Well, 400 represents 100% of the amount, and we want to find out the 5%. Well, if 10% is represented by 40, then 5% will be represented by half. Half of 40 is 20. So 20 represents the 5%, whereas 40 represents the 10%. So let's decrease it now. And we're going to get 380, and this represents 95% of the original. Okay. Now let's make a 20% decrease on 400. 400 represents the original 100%, and we want to find 20%. Well, if 10% is 40, then 20% will be twice the 40. Should I say 80? So 80 represents the 20%, whereas 40 represents the 10%. So let's decrease it by 80, and we'll get 320. So we're looking at 2. Okay, and this represents 80%. Okay, finally, let's do a 25% on 400. 400 represents, once again, 100%. And we're looking for what would represent 25%. Well, 20% is represented by 80, and 5% is represented by 20. When I combine the 80 and the 20, I'll get 100. And that's our 25%. We're combining the 20 and the 5. So let's decrease it by 100, and we'll get 300. And this represents 75% of the original.